So last week, I introduced the topic of marriage in the context of understanding sexuality. Now we need to actually spend some time looking at kinship and marriage and look at all the different ways that gender and age play out in terms of how relationships, again, between individuals are organized. So I've broken this up into two big chunks. The first looks at kinship and gender, focusing on patterns of descent and how we figure out our various degrees of relatedness to other people in our group. And then marriage and genders. And so we'll look at some of the different marriage patterns that are present. And then I'll briefly talk about exchange, because marriage is, as we'll talk about, a socio-legal economic contract. So it's not simply just a cultural thing, but it has important political, legal, economic consequences. So I always start this lecture with the worst pun ever, that kinship is relative. And what I mean by that is that who our kin are and how we acknowledge who we are related to depends on the individual. So this is what I mean, that kindred are ego-centered, that we have, as we'll see, these structures that tell us who we're related to, but ultimately individuals have a say to some degree in terms of who they actually acknowledge as being their kin. And so we have a whole bunch of different kinds of kin categories. The two major ones are being consanguinal or blood kin or biological kin, and then affinal kin, which is our in-laws or kin individuals that we're related to by marriage. Because the reason, where to start here? The key here is that when we look at who people think their kin are, one of the reasons why it matters is because our property and our social status are transmitted through these systems. And so there are two major types of descent patterns that we can look at. First is bilateral descent, where an individual claims ties to a broad network of kin. So this is what a bilateral system looks like. And you'll note that when we draw kinship diagrams, and I talk about this in the notes below, we use standardized symbols. So triangles are males, circles are females, equal signs refer to a marriage or a union. Vertical lines represent descent, right? So 11 here is descended from 3 and 4. So this is their offspring. And then 11 has 2 offspring themselves. So we see this horizontal relationship between members of the same generation within a kinship system. And we call this bilateral because if we look at this kind of central group here, comprised of 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, what we see is that they may identify as having a broad range of kin from both sides of their family. So both of 11 sisters are married, and so they may see that this relationship through marriage, basically their in-law relationships composed of 9 and his family, and then 13 and his family, are seen as part of the kinship system of members of this kind of central group where the two dotted lines and solid lines in red overlap. We can also have unilineal descent, and there are two major forms of unilineal descent. The first is patrilineal, and so on, again, this standardized kinship diagram here, individuals shaded in red represent members of the patrilineage. So we start with our patriarch at the top, his offspring, then his male offspring's offspring, and then that male's male's offspring, if that makes sense. So basically in a patrilineage, you are a member of the patrilineage based on how you are related to the male adults or senior members of your kinship grouping. On the other side here, what we see is that while 5 as a female is part of her father's patrilineage, right? Her children are part of her husband's lineage, right? So that's why these individuals here are not shaded, right? They have their own patrilineage. And in some societies, based on, again, how the patrilineage works, this daughter of number 1, so number 5, may actually become part of her husband's patrilineage. And so she may no longer have the same access to resources and status and property, etc., because she's now married into another patrilineage. The other form of unilineal descent is matrilineal descent. And so again, this operates in the same way as a patrilineage, but focusing not on the male line, but rather on the female members of the group. So we see instead of 1, now we have 2 and her offspring, her daughter and her daughter's offspring, and again, then her granddaughter and her granddaughter's offspring. Okay. And so we see in these kinship diagrams all of these different criteria of relatedness we can use to make kinship distinctions, right? So we can look at, again, generations, right? That we use different kinship terminology for individuals who are part of the same generation as ego, but are not a sibling. Of course, sex or gender is important. Whether or not it is sex or gender that is being used, again, depends on ego and ego's culture. So we've already talked about affinity or connection through marriage. Again, often in kinship, we distinguish this through the use of terms like mother versus mother-in-law. We can also have collaterality, which is basically how basically direct or indirect we are seen as related to an individual, right? So parents are often those terms are used to denote direct connotations, but aunt and uncle denote relations on the same generation as mother and father, but again, separated by one person, right? That we are linked to that individual through our mother or our father. Of course, the term uncle versus aunt in this case refers to the gender or the sex of the linking relative. As it notes here, in English, we do not distinguish between these two, although what's interesting is acknowledging that other family structures exist, other forms of sexuality exist, and of course, stepping outside of heteronormativity in terms of gender and sex, we also have now the innovation of terms like nuncle, or nibblings. So we're starting to see increased use of gender neutral terminology versus those that are gender specific. But some cultures do distinguish this quite clearly. So they have a term for example, as it states here, your father's brother, as well as your father's brother's children. And so we have the distinction between what we call parallel cousins versus cross cousins. And I'll show you the figure in a second that shows this. Again, in English, we don't have a distinction between relatives that are on our mother's versus our father's side. Instead, we have to describe this, right? So we have to talk about mother's brother versus father's brother. Same with age, right? That we don't have a separate term that's applied to our father's youngest brother from our father's oldest brother, right? So these are all the different ways in which we can distinguish between members of our kin. So this is just to illustrate cross versus parallel cousins. So with cross cousins, basically you are looking at your parents' opposite sex sibling and their offspring, right? So we can see here that ego's father's sister, so ego's aunt through the father's line, her children are referred to as cross cousins, whereas basically cousins that are linked through a same-sex sibling of your parents, so your father's brother's children, are considered to be parallel cousins. And the distinction between cross and parallel cousins is important for some cultures because in some cultures you can marry cross cousins but not parallel cousins. Or in other cultures, the reverse can be true, where marriage to parallel cousins is preferred, often because this ensures that status and property are maintained within that lineage, particularly within the patrilineage. So again, distinguishing between cross and parallel cousins and having different terms for them can be really critical in terms of determining who or who is not an acceptable marriage partner. So here's a sample of an exercise. This would be something like you would see on an exam where I'll give you a generalized kinship diagram. I will not have any of the figures shaded except for in the case ego. And so the question relates to who would ego consider to be members of their patrilineage versus their matrilineage, because we don't know who this individual belongs to, a matrilineal or patrilineal society, who are their cross cousins, who are their parallel cousins. And so for this response, if we were to answer the first question in a patrilineage, well, it means their father. So we have to know what the symbols mean. We know that a triangle is male, and so we know that 14 or ego is descended from 5 and 6. So their patrilineage involves number 6. All of 6's offspring, so 14, including ego, and 12, and then all of the patriarchs' male families kin, so it'd be 12, 19, and 20. You'll notice that ego, because ego is female, ego's own children are not part necessarily of ego's patrilineage. They're part of ego's husbands or ego's male partner's patrilineage. So again, it all depends on how that society works. And then again, of course, under a matrilineage, then we can go further up higher in this kinship chart because, of course, we can look at mother and grandmother and then offspring through there. So, of course, focusing on kinship is useful in terms of understanding how a society is structured, but it also, as you might be able to tell already, is really useful for telling us a lot about how gender works, right? And tells us a lot about the status of men and women, in particular, in different kinship systems, right? And so we can look at, for example, how power then can be either denied or given to different genders on the basis of the role they play within a kinship structure. So when I talk about patrilineage and matrilineage in the previous slide notes, I give you some examples of cultures where these are present and how it operates in terms of transmission of things like status and property. But Cully and Yeg and Nasako also talk about women as kin keepers. And so how women often play a role in society of being basically the individuals who keep their family or their kin unit together, right? So they remember all the birthdays and anniversaries. They're the ones who organize meals and bring family members together. They know how to contact different family members, and they're often a key source of information about what is going on with everyone, right? So they're talking to other family members about what so-and-so are up to. And so this can be a really important source of power for women within kin networks, right? Because they can basically set who is basically still connected within the kin group and then who is also marginalized and or pushed aside. Power, of course, in kinship can play a more direct role in terms of how status then is earned or awarded or achieved within a society. So again, you can think about how lineal descent and patriarchies are particularly important in the form of a lot of monarchies and their rules of succession. Note that the British Crown rules of succession changed when William and Kate were pregnant with their first child because it wasn't determined what the offspring, what their sex was on the basis of the ultrasounds. The Parliament actually changed the rules of succession. So regardless of the sex or the gender of their child, the eldest child of William and Kate would inherit the crown through William, right? Whereas before it was only the eldest male child. But because the British Empire has had so many successful queens, including our present queen, Queen Elizabeth, it was determined that this discrimination on the basis of sex or gender was no longer appropriate, right? That whether the ruler was male or female, or even you'd like to think potentially a non-binary other, it wouldn't matter, right? Note that this form of hereditary or scribe leadership is often visually identifiable, right? That this is set apart. However, in other societies, status or leadership is an achieved process, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about subsistence and inequities. So this is important to note that just because you belong to a particular lineage doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get all of the statuses that come along with it. So my daughter, for example, I always joke about, was disappointed when she found out that she was not automatically a doctor because her mommy was, right? Because me earning my PhD was my own personal achievement, and the status that comes with that is not something that can be inherited, right? It's not a form of ascribed or hereditary title, but rather one that is individually achieved or earned. Then we can talk about how this impacts how a family itself is structured, right? Because a family is seen as kind of a smaller unit that is part of the broader kinship network. And so this plays out in a number of different ways. And so is an incomplete list of some forms of families that anthropologists have been able to identify, and I've provided you for definitions for these below, but I'd also encourage you to seek out your own definitions that you can then apply and share to our wiki for the course as well. Of course, families are not static, nor is culture, so we see the transformation of families over time through a number of different structures and processes, right? And we're going to talk about one of these, death, towards the end of the term, but it's important to note that in many societies, you do not cease being an individual's kin simply because you have died, right? So people continue to be our kin, and we acknowledge their role in our kinship system even after death. In other societies, this is not the case. In other cultures, when someone dies, there's rules around using their name, around who can have the same name as them, around referring to them, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, adoption is another critical way that we transform families, and acknowledges that, again, that these affinal connections do not necessarily need to be through kind of in-law relationships, but there's other legal mechanisms and also informal social mechanisms by which individuals can become our kin, and adoption is one of these. And of course, in this course, we've done some readings looking at reproductive technologies, again, the work of Rigoni, who shows that how this also shapes our ideas around who our kin is a gamete donor part of our kin network, even though because of that biological connection? Well, not necessarily. Sometimes the social connection is more important than the biological one. And that's basically what I've talked about here. So that then leads us to marriage, the formal public social contract, which is a legal, political, and economic contract that basically is one of the ways in which kin is constructed, right? Because it regulates our sexuality. It confers sexual rights to individuals. It defines the identity of offspring, right? And this provides us the context for enculturation, which is our topic next week, which is the mechanism by which we learn the appropriate ways of thinking and feeling within our culture. And it also provides for the care of children, right? It says who is responsible for offspring of these unions. Marriage, of course, establishes important economic partnerships. And there's a lot of great examples of this that come from popular culture, right? If you think about Game of Thrones, for one example, shows all the different ways that marriage can be not for love, but for economic and political alliances, right? Through the construction of these affinal or in-law ties and connections, and establishes alliances. Aside from taking care of children, it also allocates other rights and responsibilities, including the transmission of wealth and social status, involves the care of elders as well, and we'll return towards this towards the end of the term. Marriage is an important rite of passage, therefore it is one that is symbolically marked, one with a ceremony, and often one that is very public, right? That acknowledges that as a group, everyone is saying that, yes, we now recognize this union between these individuals, and these are the consequences of that. So the last piece we need to talk about then is what we've been able to interpret from cross-cultural comparison is all the different forms of marriage patterns. So I'm just going to go through these briefly. Again, a lot of these are just becoming familiar with these definitions and what these terms mean. So we can talk about endogamy, or marriage within a group. So this is where there is preference towards marrying a member of your community. Many religions reinforce this idea, the idea that you should only marry someone of the same religion as you. But we also have exogamy, where there's encouragement and support towards marrying an individual from outside of your group. And the argument for this is, rather than kind of keeping it all within that group or that community, instead what we're doing is extending our kinship network and promoting alliances and allegiances between members of these groups. And both of these are often shaped by an understanding of what the incest taboo is, right? The idea of, individuals who are potentially biologically related to you, or even socially related to you, as being too close, right? So you have to marry some sort of other. So what is monogamy then? It's a marriage form where a person can have only one spouse at a time, and in many industrialized nations, this is the only legal option. But there's variation then in terms of how many times a monogamous person can be married. So in our society, because of how divorce works, we can practice what is called serial monogamy, that you can be married to one individual at a time, but over your lifetime, you can go through a series of successive marriages, divorces, and marriages, right? Other societies do not permit this, that you basically only get one shot at being married to one individual, and there are no formal mechanisms for breaking or dissolving that bond. Polygamy is a catch-all term that's used for multiple marriages, and so this is when an individual can be married to more than one individual at a time, and we do have some specific terms. Polygyny is a form of polygamy, where you have the marriage of one man to more than one woman. And I summarize some of the explanations for why this exists. And again, applying cultural relativism is very important, because in our society, polygamy in any form is illegal, and polygyny is one that is extremely marginalized because it's associated with other cultural practices such as child marriage or early marriage, for example, that we have decided is a criminal activity and have made illegal. But in other societies, this is a family structure and a marriage pattern that is seen as preferential and beneficial, because it provides a lot of labor for women who often run the household. So you have many women running the household, cooperating together, and their offspring sharing those responsibilities. We can also see it in societies that have what's called a postpartum sex taboo. And so this is where there is a period of duration postpartum, or after an individual's had a child, in which they are not to engage in any sexual behavior. So the idea is that while that woman is recovering after birth, the husband has other spouses who are sexual partners who he can engage in that activity with. We can also have polyandry. So polyandry is where you have the marriage of one woman to multiple males or multiple men. I note here that it is the rarest form of marriage. We have very few examples of this. And often when we see it, it's in response to environmental stressor pressures, that usually there's not enough or sufficient land resources. So you don't want to kind of divide the land further when you have multiple children who are then marrying multiple spouses, that if brothers can share the land, as is seen in Tibet and parts of Nepal, or in parts of Tibet as well, what happens then is that a single woman will have multiple males, often brothers, which is why we call it fraternal polyandry, and then they can share the land, not further divide it. They can farm the land, and then all of their children can then inherit that land as well, right? So it's a response to kind of stress and pressure around land and other resources. I mentioned that marriage is not just a social and political contract, but it also is often accompanied by economic exchange. And I note here that 75% of societies have one or more explicit transactions that take place before or after marriage. And this is an old diagram that shows some of the different forms it takes. I was just going to highlight one, bride wealth, because it's often misunderstood and misrepresented in Western cultures. And it's simply the transfer of symbolically important goods from the family of the groom to the family of the bride on the occasion of the marriage. The idea is that that woman is now leaving that kin group and entering another. Therefore, that kin group is losing her labor, they're losing her fertility. And so as such, they're being kind of compensated for that. In many societies, it's seen as recognition of her worth, her value, and her status. But importantly, it allows for the maintenance of status and class distinctions, because what it ensures is a form of endogamy where people are only basically marrying people within their same class grouping, right? That only those individuals with the means to marry someone who is worth, quote unquote, worth a lot, has the means to marry that individual, because they also have substantial resources with them. So bringing together all of these ideas of the social and legal and economic consequences of marriage, Our reading by Childs, Goldstein, and Wang Dewey discusses this, that what happens when we have a traditional fraternal polyandry structure that is now changing under the process of globalization. And so what Childs et al. Look at is the tension and the challenges that have resulted from a shift from a traditional structure into a contemporary structure. And I just want to highlight the importance of the creation of social capital that occurs between the relationships between daughters and parents. I've also then included this reading by Archambault. I think this is a really useful reading of looking again at a bunch of these ideas we've now talked about in this course, including circumcision or female circumcision, around early marriage practices, around the age of consent. And then this one frames it around kind of a rights-based approach, because often as anthropologists, one of the challenges we get to cultural relativism is human rights, and particularly around early marriage or child marriage practices. And so Archambault talks about this, about how we frame marriage, how we understand what is meant by child versus early. How does human rights come into play, and also how do representational frameworks that anthropologists often are responsible for producing oversimplify complex issues, right? So basically what Archambault is trying to do is understand why early marriage practices occurs, and then also why attempts to change this traditional cultural practice have failed because of how essentially it's been framed, and instead saying, well, if you frame it this way and understand it this way, this is one of the ways that we can actually transform this cultural practice in a way that benefits people and doesn't take away their livelihood or their right to cultural autonomy as well. So this is what we call an applied anthropological approach. Okay, so that's it for this topic this week, and we'll see you soon.